Rzeczywiście jest kulą zawieszoną w kosmosie?
Jest płaska. Tak jak oczekują i nie spodziewałem się, co prawda, tego pytania, ale zapewniam pana, że jest płaska.
Generał Mirosław Hermaszewski, jak dotąd pierwszy i ostatni Polak, który odbył lot orbitalny. Dziękuję serdecznie za rozmowę.
Dzięki. Dziękuję, kłaniam się.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened. And if it didn't happen, it's nice to know why it didn't happen, so in the future, if we want to keep doing something, we need to know why something stopped in the past that we wanted to keep it going. Money.
At this point, we are left with only one consideration to make. If it's true, like all this evidence seems to suggest, that someone at NASA decided to fake the lunar landings, they would have certainly needed to convince the astronauts to play their role all the way through to the end. It could not have been possible to fake the lunar landings without their full cooperation. And astronauts are some exceptional people, courageous and motivated by a deep sense of pride, which comes from constantly putting their lives at risk in order to advance the progress of science. It must have not been easy for them to participate in such a fraud just to satisfy the need of the United States to affirm their leadership in front of the entire world. Let's then take a closer look at the story of the three most famous astronauts of all: Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, the historical crew of Apollo 11. On July 24, 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins triumphantly returned from the most important mission ever accomplished in human history. They have just been on the moon. They are the first human beings to have ever visited another celestial body and to have safely returned from it. On the recovery ship, they are welcomed by President Nixon in person. After a brief exchange in front of the cameras, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are placed in quarantine for a few weeks of isolation. Then, on September 16, they appear for a press conference in front of the global members of the press, who welcome them with a standing ovation. Everyone expects to see three absolute heroes radiating with happiness and pride for their incredible achievement. But their faces appear somber, tense, somehow preoccupied instead. They seem uncomfortable, and there are several truly embarrassing moments during the event. When the three astronauts are asked the meaning of a mission that has brought mankind on another celestial body for the first time, the three don't seem too eager nor too enthusiastic about answering the question.
Many of us and many other people in many places have speculated on the meaning of this first landing on another body in space. Would each of you give us your estimate of what is the meaning of this to all of us?
And when Armstrong describes their achievement as the beginning of a new era, he seems more like a person forced to read from a script than someone actually convinced of his own words.
The entire program, it's a beginning of a new age.
Possibly the most embarrassing moment of all comes when the famous astronomer and journalist Sir Patrick Moore asks the astronauts whether they could see stars from the moon.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
But not one of them, surprisingly, remembers having seen a single star by the naked eye.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics.
Even Collins, who was left orbiting the moon while the other two descended on the surface, does not remember seeing a single star.
I don't remember seeing any.
This is a truly disconcerting fact, given that their colleagues from the Gemini missions, who flew in space a few years before them, recall the long hours spent looking at the stars.
we'd spend several hours just with our faces pressed up against the window at night with all the lights turned down low and watching the stars.
Also, the astronauts from the shuttle missions, like, for example, James Riley, recall seeing literally millions of stars in outer space.
What are the stars like in space? Like, are they just brighter than on Earth, or how would you describe it?
They're brighter, but they're different. And a lot of things different about it. One, you don't have the atmospheric distortion, so they don't twinkle, right? So you see lots of points, and you see lots of points, and that literally millions of them.
One wonders where the Apollo 11 astronauts have truly been in the crucial 8 days of their mission, given that they don't remember seeing a single star by naked eye. Another surprising fact is that, instead of pursuing a successful career within NASA after their triumphant mission, the 3 astronauts suddenly decided to leave the space agency. A little over a year after their mission, with the Apollo program still in full swing, all 3 astronauts resign from NASA. Armstrong literally disappears from the scene, moves to the country, decides not to give any more interviews, and shuns the public eye. And when NASA celebrates the completion of the Apollo program, which has carried 12 men to the moon in the course of 3 years, the most important of all, Neil Armstrong refuses to take part in the ceremony. Buzz Aldrin also falls into a deep state of depression, which leads him towards the abuse of drugs and alcohol.
I thrived on addictive substances, alcoholism, and clearly that began to predominate in my unstructured life.
In 1973, he appears in a photo in Paris Match, definitely changed in his physical aspect. To the French magazine, Aldrin declares, "They think of us as heroes, but the moon has destroyed us." In a 1994 interview, Aldrin is asked to give some advice to the young people who want to become astronauts in the future. But instead of encouraging them and inspiring them with enthusiasm, he warns them against possible disappointments.
Space and its frontiers certainly are new and challenging, and because they're new and challenging, they're also uncertain, and I think anyone aspiring that as a career field has to be equipped with a lot of patience and the ability to cope with things not turning out exactly the way they may perceive that they would ahead of time.
Why would a man who has just accomplished the most important mission in the history of mankind warn young people against the risk of disappointments and failures?
Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Armstrong.
Armstrong sometimes reappears in public, but it's definitely not to sing a praise for NASA. In a ceremony hosted by Bill Clinton in 1994, Armstrong makes an ambiguous and mysterious statement. While talking to a group of students, he mentions some of truth's protective layers that young people should try to remove in order to go on.
We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
Later on, Armstrong stuns reporters again when he refuses to take part in the celebrations of the 40th anniversary of the Apollo mission. In 2004, filmmaker Bart Sibrel produces a documentary called Astronauts Gone Wild, in which he interviews the astronauts from the Apollo missions and asks them to swear on the Bible that they really have been on the moon. We must keep in mind that in the United States, a sworn testimony filmed on camera can be used in a court against the person who has made that testimony. And in the United States, perjury is a crime that can even end you up in jail. We don't know if this is the actual reason, but it's interesting to notice that once Neil Armstrong realizes he is being filmed by Sibrel's camera, he refuses to swear on the Bible.
I wanted to give you the opportunity to swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon. Will you put your left hand on the Bible and swear to God that you walked on the moon?
Gentlemen. Mr. Sibrel.
Yes? If you really walked on the moon, why would you not do that? So why don't you just put the...
Even after Sibrel offers him $5,000 in cash to be given to charity, Armstrong still refuses to swear.
You have $5,000 cash. You can give it to charity if you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon. I have the tape.
That'd be fine.
Why don't you swear to... Why not? Why won't you do it?
Buzz Aldrin also refuses to swear.
Why don't you swear? Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon? Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon? Why don't you swear in the Bible that you walked on the moon?
Sibrel keeps insisting and even insults Aldrin until the former astronaut hits him with a punch.
And a thief.
But at the end of the day, just like Armstrong did, Aldrin also refused to swear. Michael Collins, too, the third Apollo astronaut, refuses to swear, and actually runs from Sibrel as if he had seen the devil.
Well, asking you to swear in the Bible that you orbited the moon.
Would you please go away?
Well, if you really orbited the moon, why won't you swear in the Bible that you did so? I just don't understand why if you orbited the moon, you wouldn't have a problem about swearing to the Bible on it.
Sibrel certainly doesn't have a pleasant approach, but if someone has really been on the moon, why not swear anyway? All you would have needed to do to get rid of the nuisance would have been to stretch your hand out and swear on the Bible. On top, Armstrong could have given $5,000 in charity by simply performing that act. But none of the three astronauts wanted to do it. Why?
Okay, now, you think you can chip off the...
Another piece of evidence for the lunar landings often mentioned is the moon rocks. All those samples of rocky material that the astronauts allegedly brought back to Earth from their missions to the moon. Being composed of different material than the Earth, claim the debunkers, these rocks are the tangible proof that man went to the moon. From the debunking site Clavius, we can read, "The lunar surface samples returned by the Apollo missions are considered by many to be the most compelling evidence that the missions were authentic." On its own website, NASA writes, "Moon rocks and common sense prove Apollo astronauts really did visit the moon." In reality, these alleged moon rocks by themselves don't prove anything. Even accepting that their composition is different from that of the Earth, we must remember that many meteorites originating from the moon have been retrieved in Antarctica.
Well, I got a phone call once, a fellow at the Smithsonian, and he said, "Jerry, we have now a meteorite which I just brought back from Antarctica, which is from the moon." A whole assembly of scientists attacked this object, and at the end of a year and a half, the conclusion was it was a moon rock. It was unambiguously a moon rock.
And it's certainly a curious coincidence that Wernher von Braun and some of his NASA colleagues visited Antarctica in 1967, exactly 1 year before the beginning of the lunar missions. As stated by the New World Encyclopedia, the expedition was one of the first to systematically search the ice surface for meteorites believed to originate from the moon for later use as a reference material. Nothing forbids that this reference material could have been later used as original after the Apollo missions. Furthermore, it is possible that the diversity of the lunar rocks was obtained with some special processing here on Earth, as suggested by Bill Wood, an aerospace engineer.
And then I think the vast majority of the hundreds of pounds of moon rocks that we claim to have are made here on Earth. They can be irradiated or exposed to a vacuum or modified in certain minor ways so that they appear slightly different.
In fact, in 2009, it was discovered that a lunar rock donated by the American astronauts to a Dutch museum was actually a piece of petrified wood. A cheap, earthly fake presented to the world as if it were a precious lunar rock. But even if these rocks really came from the moon, they could have been retrieved by an unmanned probe, and not necessarily by humans. Again, the same thing was done by the Soviets, with their unmanned probes Luna 16, 20, and 24. Thus, in no case, regardless of their origin and composition, can the so-called lunar rocks be considered proof that man went to the moon. And one is left to wonder, why would NASA feel the need to state that the lunar rocks prove that we went to the moon, when they are the first ones to know that this is definitely not the case? Let's now discuss the actual lunar landings. We will start by examining the lunar spaceship, or LEM, which has allegedly brought 12 astronauts to walk on the surface of the moon in the course of 6 different missions. The LEM, or Lunar Module, is the vehicle that was designed to carry astronauts to the surface of the moon. But this very LEM raises so many questions that many doubt this vehicle has actually ever reached the moon. They suspect this is only a mock-up model sitting on a movie set instead. Seen from a distance, the LEM appears like a technological wonder, But once we get up close, we realize that it looks more like a mock-up model, somehow put together with steel tubes and papier-mâché, held together with simple Scotch tape. What immediately catches the eye is the large amounts of Scotch tape, haphazardly placed here and there, as if it were a...
Per esempio è che il modo lunare è rivestito di lamierino, si vede addirittura che è unito con lo Scotch, quindi era un simulacro di cartapesta. No, non è vero, perché si va a vedere la documentazione tecnica, è stata fuori che il modo migliore per applicare senza aggravare il peso il rivestimento termico in modo che non venisse surriscaldato dal sole era di usare dei giunti adesivi invece della rivecchiatura che con la dilatazione termica avrebbero causato delle sollecitazioni.
But this explanation doesn't stand to scrutiny. As one can see, the LEM is full of metal rivets everywhere. There is therefore no explanation for the sloppiness in the construction of the Luna module, with the engines covered with aluminum foil, the external panels not even lining up with each other, and the Scotch tape that seems added at the last moment, just to keep together pieces that would otherwise fall apart. The Luna module cost over $2 billion at the time, which is the equivalent of $21 billion in 2016. The second problem posed by the LEM is that there is no crater in the sand caused by the jet of the engine during the landing. According to the debunkers, this crater should not exist at all, because the LEM uses very little power when it lands, they say, and it does so on a rocky volcanic surface anyway.
Sulla Luna, essendoci un sesto di gravità, il peso che deve essere sostenuto dal motore è un sesto, quindi la spinta che viene scaricata sul terreno è molto modesta. Non c'è motivo di produrre un cratere, oltretutto in una superficie rocciosa, di roccia vulcanica come è quella della Luna.
But the surface where the LEM supposedly landed is not rocky at all, like Activissimo claims. Neil Armstrong himself refutes this statement when he describes a fine-grained, almost powdery surface instead.
The surface appears to be very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder.
A similar comment is made by Alan Shepard, one of the astronauts from Apollo 14. James Irwin from Apollo 15 even describes a layer of soft soil about 6 inches deep around the LEM's footpads.
No wonder we slid, Dave. Boy, that's really soft dirt there around the front footpads. Sure is. Like about 6 inches deep of soft material.
In fact, during the landing approach, we can clearly see large amounts of dust being blown away by the LEM's engine.
Great shadow.
But then, why is there no hollow underneath? This animation helps us better understand what should have happened during the landing on the moon. Just like this leaf blower, which blows away the dust on the surface and reveals the hard rock underneath, we would expect to see a hollow in the sand under the LEM, revealing the hard terrain under the surface. But the hollow is not there. This animation shows the landing of the Phoenix probe on Mars, which took place in 2008. As one can see, the Phoenix also uses rockets to land on the surface of the planet. And these are the actual images sent back to Earth by the Phoenix after it landed. As one can see, the sand on the surface has been blown away by the rockets, which are seen above, revealing the hard terrain underneath. Why hasn't the same thing happened under the Luna module? Question. If a simple leaf blower can remove the dust from the surface, revealing the hard rock underneath, why has the same not happened under the engine of the LEM? And why do we still see several pebbles sitting under the engine, which weren't even blown away during the landing of the LEM? Given that James Irwin described about 6 inches deep of soft material around the footpads, why is there no hole in the sand under his LEM's engine cone? A problem connected to the missing crater under the rocket is the total absence of dust in the landing footpads. If this is the dust being blown in all directions during the landing, why is there no trace of the dust in the footpads whatsoever? In this case, Activissimo seems to have a very particular explanation as well.
La prima missione era molto sperimentale e gli ordini erano: appena tocchi il suolo devi spegnere il motore. Invece era tanta l'emozione e la tensione di quel primo allunaggio che non si sono ricordati di spegnere il motore. Lasciando il motore acceso, spazzano via tutta la polvere che c'è intorno al modulo lunare ed è per questo che le zampe sono pulite.
But the statement by Activissimo is demonstrably false. All one has to do is check the original video from the landing of Apollo 11 to realize that Armstrong orders the engine shut off right after the contact lights have come on, which is before the LEM actually touches the ground.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent.
Also, in the statement released after the mission, Armstrong confirms that the engine shutoff took place just before the LEM touched the ground.
In any case, the engine shutdown was not very high above the surface. It was quite close.
Furthermore, the absence of dust in the footpads can also be noticed in other missions, such as Apollo 12 or Apollo 14, which means the explanation by Activissimo is not valid anyway. In any case, the debunkers must make up their mind. You cannot maintain that the jet from the engine was too weak to create a hollow in the sand, and yet strong enough to completely blow off the sand from the footpads during the moon landing. One of the two statements must be false. We then ask the following questions. Given that this is the amount of dust thrown around by the descent engine, why is there no dust whatsoever in the LEM's footpads? How is it possible that the jet from the engine is at the same time strong enough to wipe the footpads clean, but weak enough not to even form a crater in the sand during the moon landing?
There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
There is also, according to the debunkers, some physical evidence for the moon landings, which they claim to be irrefutable. One such piece of evidence is the presence on the moon of the so-called retroreflector. This is an object capable of returning a laser beam to Earth, which was allegedly left by the astronauts on the surface of the moon. According to the Mythbusters, this retroreflector represents irrefutable and conclusive evidence that man went to the moon.
There's time for just one final test. And not just any old test, but the ultimate proof of man's moon mission.
What's this?
A reflector.
In fact, it's called a retroreflector, made up of many tiny prisms just like this. If there was a retroreflector on the moon, and we knew its exact location, and we had a powerful enough laser, we could detect the reflection and prove there is man-made equipment on the moon.
So what you're saying is that we get a really big laser and point it at the reflector on the moon, and if we get a signal back, that means that we were in fact there.
Precisely.
In order to prove their point, the Mythbusters conducted an experiment from the Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico.
This thing right here is the Apache Point Observatory, and these guys have the tools that we need to put the final nail in the coffin on the moon landing hoax.
That's the location where Apollo 15 landed on the moon.
That is so cool.
Initiating laser on retroreflector from Apollo 15. And there's a spike beginning to stand out.
Is that it?
That's the return from Apollo 15. Light returning from the laser retroreflector at exactly the wavelength and distance that we were expecting.
But it's really thrilling to watch it happen right in front of us.
Not just thrilling, but conclusive.
We shined that laser at the moon on the second test, and we got a clear spike back. Photons came back to our receptor. Now, the only way that could happen is if there was a piece of man-made equipment up on the moon to reflect them back.
It may seem like conclusive evidence, but it is far from that. It's in fact perfectly possible to bounce a laser beam off the lunar surface and detect it on Earth without the aid of any particular instrument. This kind of experiment had already been successfully conducted by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1962, 6 years before the Apollo missions. From the December 1966 issue of National Geographic, we can read, 4 years ago, a ruby laser, considerably smaller than those now available, shot a series of pulses at the moon, 240,000 miles away. The beams were reflected back to Earth with enough strength to be measured by ultra-sensitive electronic equipment. A similar experiment was replicated by the Soviets 1 year later. From the New York Times of November 4th, 1963, we can read, a concentrated beam of light has been bounced off the moon and detected on Earth by a Soviet observatory in Crimea. The feat duplicates an experiment conducted late last year by engineers of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It was 6 whole years before the Apollo missions, and it was already possible to bounce a laser beam off the moon with no need of a retroreflector. Furthermore, assuming that such an object is actually present on the moon, this doesn't mean that it was brought up there by astronauts. A retroreflector could have been easily placed on the surface of the moon by an unmanned probe. The Soviets had done exactly the same thing in the same years when they sent retroreflectors to the moon with their unmanned probes, Lunokhod 1 and Lunokhod 2. In no case, then, can the retroreflector be considered a valid proof in favor of the Apollo missions, let alone a definitive one. Another proof of the moon landings, according to the NASA supporters, are the images of the lunar surface sent to the Earth by unmanned probes in recent years. In 2009, the American probe Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter completed a full mapping of the lunar surface, sending back the images of what purportedly are the landing sites of the Apollo missions. Obviously, it's hard to consider these images as an actual proof of the landings when NASA itself is suspected of having falsified the pictures from 6 entire missions to the moon back in the 60s. Today, a kid armed with Photoshop could produce images similar to these in no more than half an hour. Somewhat different is the case of the Japanese probe, Kaguya. In 2008, this probe scanned the entire lunar surface, sending back altimetry data that allows us to recreate the exact morphology of the lunar terrain on a computer. According to the debunkers, the fact that the images generated by Kaguya show a terrain very similar to the one seen in the Apollo pictures proves that the lunar missions were real. One example often used by the debunkers is the one of Hadley Rill, this large canyon carved on the lunar surface where the Apollo 15 mission allegedly landed.
E questo è il risultato. Ovviamente gli oggetti in primo piano non ci sono perché l'altimetro non riesce a definire anche i sassolini più piccoli, ma le colline sullo sfondo sono assolutamente identiche. Allora, come faceva la NASA ad avere delle fotografie quasi 40 anni fa di un luogo sulla Luna con la forma esattamente giusta che poi 40 anni dopo non siamo riusciti ad andare a verificare? Come faceva? Mistero.
In fact, there is no mystery here at all. As confirmed by this 1966 documentary, NASA had already sent probes to photograph the lunar landing sites from up close well before the Apollo missions had started.
Charting actual landing sites for the astronauts is the job of Lunar Orbiter. 2 of the 850-pound satellites have orbited the moon, photographing and mapping wide areas, sometimes sweeping as low as 25 miles above the surface. Here are some of the pictures helping to determine the height and slope of lunar mountains and the depth of craters.
So accurate had been the photographic surveys that NASA had been able to build a gigantic moon globe, which replicated the entire lunar surface in utmost detail. All it would have taken at that point was to film the moving surface of this globe, using, for example, this circular rail, to give the impression of really flying around the moon. Furthermore, for the Hadley Rill area in particular, NASA had built a 3-dimensional model reproducing the Apollo 15 landing site to the smallest detail. This 3-dimensional model was then hung from a ceiling upside down and was illuminated by special lights that simulated the sunlight. By filming the model with this special camera, which could get as close as a few inches to the surface, NASA was able to film the entire lunar landing approach as if it were the real thing. The images were sent to the monitors in the simulator, making them look like actual images seen from the window of the lunar module. This documentary from NASA explains how the lunar landing simulator worked.
To the left of the simulator is a three-dimensional mosaic of the moon's surface. Through closed-circuit television, it presents typical lunar landing displays marked by craters, mounds, and boulders. The mosaic gives the astronaut a realistic feel for his final landing approach. Lunar module motion is simulated by moving the map up and down for vertical motion. A camera on a dolly track provides lateral movement. Lights around the camera lens simulate lunar lighting conditions. With these two simulators, a crew can practice the basic flight elements of the Apollo mission from launch complex to landing on the moon and return to Earth.
As one can see, the images produced by the simulator are so similar to those of the actual landing that the initial argument by the debunkers can be reversed. Not only was NASA able to replicate the exact morphology of the landing sites in the studio, but they could have, in fact, simulated the entire lunar landing using the very images from their simulator without the need of actually going to the moon.
Security is going to be a very big factor with respect to space and space exploration. At some point in the future, we're going to look back and say, how did we do it without space? The Vice President will serve as the Council's the future of American space leadership. We're going to lead again. It's been a long time. It's over 25 years. Today we're taking a crucial step to secure America's future in space by reviving the National Space Council after it has been dormant almost 25 years, if you can believe it. Today's announcement sends a clear signal to the world that we are restoring America's proud legacy of leadership in space. We're going to look back and say, how did we do it without space? The Vice President will serve as the Council's
ignition, lift off.
If you don't represent women in politics,
what do you do for fun while you're in space?
I think you've seen some of it. We can do just incredible things. You know, it's fun to just float, and it's fun to we were playing. We had a little bit of time off earlier, and I think Mr. Clay has got a baseball, and we were playing baseball inside the space station, and it's really easy to hit balls a long way in space. But it's fun just to float, and it's fun to look out the windows. And it's fun to just spend time with your crewmates.
My name is Brandon, and my question for Doug.
Technology, you're going to have a part in that, and that'll be very exciting.
I just want to thank you very much. And Dr. Whitson, congratulations. Amazing. What an amazing thing that you've done.
Now, one thing I really want your generation to embrace is that the Earth is a closed system. We cannot leave the Earth. There's no place to go.
We're never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
The sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon.
And we could not see stars.
It's not a black void. I mean, it's black, but there's all kinds of little polka dots.
There's all the stars there, and the cool thing is about it, you can see it during the day.
And when you're in space and you're looking into deep space and you're on the sun side of the orbit, the sunlight washes out all the starlight, so you can't see any stars, just like here on Earth.
There's all the stars there, and the cool thing is about it, you can see it during the day.
Yeah, you can, and there's more than stars. You can see planets. You can see moons.
You see the gas Magellan clouds of the Milky Way galaxy.
The Magellan. The sunlight washes out all the starlight, so you can't see any stars, just like here on Earth.
Pretty much all the time you can see the stars.
Then when you look out into deep space away from the sun, it's the darkest black you can imagine.
Pretty much all the time you can see the stars.
Let's now examine the problems related to the type of lighting used for the lunar pictures. There are in fact different elements suggesting that an artificial source, rather than the sun, was used to illuminate the set. This would obviously mean that the pictures were taken on Earth and not on the moon. The first element suggesting the use of artificial light are the so-called hot spots. The sun is a huge, extremely powerful source of light, capable of illuminating entire planets with its rays. For this reason, when the sun illuminates a large, flat expanse, the light reaches every visible point with the same intensity. Whether we observe an area closer to us or one in the distance, the luminosity of the ground is practically the same everywhere. This is due to the fact that the sun is thousands of times larger than the Earth, which means it can easily illuminate any portion of its surface with the same intensity. If we use an artificial light source instead, like for example a movie light, the area of illuminated terrain will be much smaller. Furthermore, at the center of the illuminated area, we will see what is called a hot spot, while as we move away from the center, we will notice a substantial decrease of luminosity called fall-off. If we now examine some pictures from the Apollo missions, we will notice the same phenomenon that we saw in the pictures taken with an artificial source. A noticeable hot spot in the center of the image and a just as noticeable drop of light as we move away from the center of the illuminated area. There is no reason why this area should appear darker than this one, this area darker than this one, or this area darker than this one. As we have seen before, when the sun illuminates a large expanse of land, its light reaches every visible point with the same intensity. If we use an artificial light instead, the illuminated area becomes brighter in the center and ever more dark as we move towards the edges. A blatant case of hot spot is found in one of the most famous pictures from NASA. This shot of Buzz Aldrin taken by Neil Armstrong during the Apollo 11 mission. Here the difference on the terrain is already visible to the naked eye, but it becomes absolutely evident for everybody after we increase the... Here we have a case of apparent levitation. The astronaut on the left takes a leap forward and then remains floating in midair, his legs dangling, while a strange force pulls him upwards. Let's watch it again in slow motion. And finally, here's a very curious situation. Look at the movement the astronaut manages to make with both his legs, first forward and then backwards, without leaning onto anything. It's as if his feet were free to slide first forward and then backwards on the ground underneath. If we straighten the frame in order to place the astronaut vertically, we will see that he is not just lifting himself on his toes. The entire lower part of the leg from the knee down is sliding forwards, then backwards. But how is it possible to slide with both feet at the same time, first forward and then backwards, without an external force pulling you upwards in the meantime? Let's now tackle one of the most debated and well-known issues in the entire lunar discussion: flags waving in the vacuum. In the videos from the Apollo missions, we can often see the American flag waving, but it's hard to tell whether it waves because it was moved by a gust of air or just because the astronaut is touching the flagpole. The Mythbusters have conducted an experiment in a vacuum chamber to prove that even in absence of air, the flag can continue waving for a while after the astronaut has touched it.
This is flag waving test in a vacuum.
Stop.
Oh, it's moving a lot. Hey, it's moving a lot.
So in the vacuum, the flag moved, not just a little bit. It actually moved quite a bit. So that proves you don't need wind in order to move the flag in a vacuum.
But then it's the Mythbusters themselves who raise the ante by throwing this challenge.
So unless someone finds a shot of the flag flapping without an astronaut manipulating the flagpole, it's myth busted.
Unless someone finds a shot of the flag flapping without an astronaut manipulating the flagpole, they said. Well, we have found at least 3 situations where the flag waves without anyone touching it. The first one is from this television sequence from Apollo 15. Here, one of the 2 astronauts is standing next to the flag, having his picture taken by his colleague. This is one of the shots taken. And this is the camera mounted on the rover, broadcasting the images on live television.
Okay.
After a while, the astronaut exits frame to the left.
You like that flag there, Joe?
A few seconds later, one of the 2 astronauts walks back in front of the camera, headed to the LEM. After he passes, we notice that the flag is waving without anyone having touched it. Let's watch again. Some debunkers have suggested that the astronaut could have touched the flag with his elbow as he was passing by. But a simple triangulation with the photographic image shows that this was not possible. In order to fill up the frame to this point from the top of the head to the waist, the astronaut must have been somewhere halfway between the flag and the camera. There is too much distance for him to have touched the flag with his elbow.
I don't think BDS was ever supposed to be about getting colleges to take their money out of Israel. So if we focus on the dollars, we could feel really good about ourselves. If we focus on the fact that an effort's being made to distance us, those who love Israel, from the rising generation, I think we need to worry. When you get to the millennials and the students, it's a bad situation. And it's getting to the point now where the majority is more favorable towards the Palestinians than the Israelis.
An opinion on this picture was asked of Jan Lundberg, the Hasselblad technician responsible for providing NASA with the cameras for the Apollo missions. When shown the Aldrin picture, Lundberg had to acknowledge, with some embarrassment, that the image seems to have been shot under a movie light, and was unable to provide a valid explanation for that.
Yes, it seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why? So maybe you have to find Armstrong and ask him.
The professional photographers were also very surprised by this noticeable and inexplicable fall-off of light in the distance.
È chiaro che qua c'è una caduta di luce strana. Il sole arriva così, ma è strana che qui sia più buio che lassù, sembra un riflettore messo non centrato bene. Anche qui che è strano perché sta sorgente luminosa. Sembra ci sia una lampada con attorno un riflettore, tipico delle lampade da studio.
La scurezza della parte scura di qua, della parte in ombra qua, è superiore alla parte in ombra qua.
E non dovrebbe essere.
E non dovrebbe essere, dovrebbe essere uguale.
Qui effettivamente ci si domanda cos'è che crea questa fascia di ombra, perché in teoria è un deserto e quindi... Sì, anche qui no, perché è più scuro qui, sembra come che non c'è motivo che queste colline sia, perché il sole è a milioni di chilometri. Sì, potrebbe essere lo scuro dovuto, diciamo, al fatto che il sole sta tramontando, è radente, ma sì. È radente, fa delle ombre semmai più lunghe, ma non questo tipo di ombra. Se fossimo in una sala di posa o se avessimo puntato un grande faro in questa scena, per quanto grande sia il faro non può mai avere una luminanza come quella naturale del sole e quindi per forza si creano delle cadute di luce. In studio hanno molto senso, in effetti diciamo in studio questo è giustificabilissimo, però qui non ha molto senso, dovrebbe essere piattamente, uniformemente illuminato dal sole. Sì, e le cadute qua sono pazzesche.
It's really funny. That is totally spotlight. But it's totally spotlit. No? It's not like at all a big light coming over there. Yeah, that is funny. Yeah, that is like totally lit. It's absolutely true. And I know these pictures. I've never thought about it.
Meno è più scuro il terreno in lontananza.
Sì.
E non si capisce perché.
Non si capisce perché.
Il sole dovrebbe illuminare il terreno.
Tutto da tutte le parti, è all'infinito la luce praticamente, no?
E sono illuminate queste cose qui, il terreno dovrebbe essere
come qui. Solito discorso.
Dà la sensazione di uno spot.
Qui, sì. Proprio un sirio, ecco. Un grande sirio.
A sirio, for those who are not professionals, is a large and powerful movie light. And curiously enough, a similar image was obtained in this documentary on the moon landings by using just that, a large movie light. As one can see, the results are very, very similar to those present in the Aldrin picture. According to Paolo Attivissimo, however, there is a different explanation for the fall-off of light in the distance. It would have been the engine of the LEM, he claims, to blow the dust away during the landing, thus revealing the lighter sand underneath.
Non è l'orizzonte del terreno lontano a essere più scuro, è quello il suo colore naturale. È la parte in primo piano che è stata pulita dal getto e quindi ha portato in superficie o ha esposto del materiale più chiaro.
But this hypothesis by Attivissimo doesn't hold water for at least two reasons. The first one is that the hotspot phenomenon takes place in different missions and in different situations, some of which are definitely far away from the landing area of the LEM. It is ludicrous to think that the lunar module would have gone around to neatly blow the dust off all these areas before it landed. Secondly, NASA itself denies the fact that the sand under the surface of the moon is lighter than the one on the surface. It is in fact the exact opposite. In this report on the Surveyor missions published in 1969, NASA wrote, "Observations of the fine-grained parts of the lunar surface disturbed by the landing and liftoff of the Surveyor 6 spacecraft have shown that the lunar material exposed at depths no greater than a few millimeters has a significantly lower normal luminance factor than the undisturbed surface. In other words, the ground swept by the lunar module's jet should appear darker than the rest, if anything, and certainly not lighter, like Attivissimo says." Another theory put forth by the debunkers to explain the inconsistent illumination of the terrain is the so-called vignetting effect, a phenomenon that sometimes occurs in pictures when the corners of the frame appear darker than the rest of the image. But vignetting is a defect that only occurs in the low-cost lenses, and certainly not in the Zeiss lenses used by Hasselblad, which are simply the best in the world.
Alcuni hanno suggerito che sia un problema di vignettatura, secondo te può esserlo?
No, se l'Hasselblad la vignettatura scherziamo, non la fa. Quindi, fosse una macchinetta da 2 lire, sì, ma...
Furthermore, several pictures show how the difference between hotspot and fall-off is present in the center of the picture, as in the case of this image reflected in the astronaut's visor. And since vignetting never takes place in the center of the image, we can state with certainty that we are facing a real phenomenon on the ground, and not a case of vignetting.
Stranamente, il sole viene da questa parte, e qua è più luminoso, come se arrivasse a illuminare questa zona e meno questa.
This is supposed to come from the sun.
Yes, the sun behind. This is the photographer.
Ridiculous thing, because there's absolutely no reason that it's darker here and there's thick. It's when you have a spot which is not strong enough.
Right.
Come here, really.
Yeah.
Here's another similar example in which the illumination problem is quite obvious. If we look at the sides of the astronaut photographer, we notice that on the left the ground is brightly lit, while on the right there is a dramatic decrease in luminosity. If this scene were truly illuminated by the sun, this area of the ground would appear as brightly lit as this one. Finally, as a possible explanation, a phenomenon called Heiligenschein has been suggested. It refers to that peculiar halo of light that sometimes appears around the shadow of the photographer in some particular situations. But the Heiligenschein effect only occurs when the sun is located exactly behind the photographer's head, along with the axis of the lens. This is the reason why the halo effect, which is due to a retroreflection phenomenon on the ground, appears all around its shadow. As we have seen instead, many of the hot spots in the NASA pictures occur when the light source is placed on the side of the photographer and not behind his head. Question: given that the sun should illuminate the whole landscape with the same intensity, both close and far away, can you explain the reason for the noticeable fall-off of light seen in many of the Apollo pictures? In this particular case, the fall-off takes place in the center of the frame, thus excluding a vignetting problem, and with the source placed on the side, thus excluding the Heiligenschein effect. Can you explain the reason for the noticeable fall-off of light that can be seen on the terrain right behind the astronaut photographer?
The new religion is very seductive. It's very soft and sweet and sticky, and it's easy to go with it and lose the Catholic faith. You have a new and different faith, a happy clappy faith, where everybody is nice, everybody is sweet, that nobody has original sin. The only sin that's still left is Nazi sin. That's the new religion. And Hitler is the devil. The 6 million are the Redeemer, which means that the Jewish people are God. That's the religion today. And that's deadly, absolutely deadly. It's got nothing to do with the Catholic faith, except that it's a clever imitation of the Catholic faith. Because you get Auschwitz instead of Golgotha, and the gas chamber instead of the cross. That's deadly. But ask yourselves, what is the real religion of people today? What's the real religion of the state today? Can I blaspheme our Lord Jesus Christ? Does anybody worry? No problem. Blaspheme as much as you like. Can I blaspheme against the Holocaust by saying that there were no gas chambers? Horror, horror, horror. Burn him at the stake. He's a heretic. There you can see what is the real religion of the government today, of politics today, and of the mass of people today. And it's not the Catholic religion. And the conciliar religion is...
What is the ISS position in orbit right now? "11 seconds.
Well, we're just passing over Baja, California, and we're heading in an arc over North America. By the time we finish talking, we'll be over Central Africa."
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. Before we learn more about NASA's
Central Africa.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing.
Central Africa.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing.
The last set of evidence includes elements that suggest the presence of air on the set of the lunar pictures. As we all know, there is no atmosphere on the moon, which means the astronauts should be moving in a situation of absolute vacuum. There are different elements, however, suggesting that we are in the presence of air instead. One such element is the behavior of the clouds of dust behind the wheels of the rover. If we were in the absence of air, all the sand lifted by the wheels should follow a perfect parabolic trajectory from the moment it leaves the wheel until the moment it falls to the ground. Being that there is no air to slow them down in their path, both the heavier particles of sand and the lighter ones should follow the same parabolic trajectory. On Earth, instead, the lighter particles of sand are slowed down by the impact with the air and remain suspended for a few seconds in midair, forming the typical clouds of dust that can be seen behind the car wheels. This phenomenon can be observed in many different situations, simply kicking up some sand, during a golf game, or during a motocross race. But it is a phenomenon that can also be observed behind the wheels of the lunar rover, where instead it should not happen. For example, look at these clouds of dust that remain momentarily suspended in midair behind the rover's wheels. As we have said before, without an atmosphere, no cloud should be forming at all. All the sand particles, both the heavier and the lighter ones, should follow the same parabolic arch. This is also confirmed by Clavius. If an atmosphere is dense enough, writes the website, it can hold small particles suspended against gravity for a short time. None of that would happen on the moon, because there's nothing to keep the dust particles suspended. And yet, small clouds of dust form repeatedly behind the rover's wheels, and briefly remain suspended in midair before falling to the ground. All of this should not happen if we were actually on the moon, where no atmosphere is present. The second piece of evidence often used in favor of the moon landings is the following. With over 400,000 people involved in the NASA project, goes the argument, someone sooner or later would have spilled the beans.
Poi vabbè, si può considerare una cosa molto banale. All'operazione Luna parteciparono 400.000 tecnici di società private, non militari, non era un'operazione di 4 gatti che lanciano un missile. Quindi tutta questa gente in 40 anni non ha mai confessato nulla.
But it's the very premise to this argument that is flawed. Nowhere does it say that all 400,000 NASA employees had to be informed of the scam being perpetrated. In fact, the lunar landing project had been split among thousands of different companies that worked all over the United States, totally independent from one another. The employees from Grumman were building the lunar module in their factories in Long Island. The technicians from ILC were designing the spacesuits in their laboratories in Delaware. The employees from Boeing were building the lunar rover in the state of Washington. The people from McDonnell Douglas worked on the Saturn rocket in their factories in California. The technicians from General Motors were producing the tanks for the command module at their home in Indiana. The experts from the Link Group developed the flight simulators in their factories in New York. As told in this documentary from that era, there were about 20,000 different companies working at the same time on the Apollo project from all over the United States.
More than 90% of the work is conducted by contractors spread across the nation. In fact, some 20,000 prime contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers located in virtually every state are participating in the manned spaceflight programs.
Thus, the idea that all these people had to be in on a plan to fake the moon landings is simply ludicrous. When a soccer player chooses to sell out a game, he certainly does not inform the rest of his team of his intentions. He acts alone, and the first ones to be duped are, in fact, his own teammates. Another example is the so-called Volkswagen scandal. In 2015, it was revealed that the German automaker had deceived the entire world by selling them cars whose engines exceeded the established emission regulations. But this doesn't mean that the entire body of 600,000 workers at Volkswagen had been informed of the scam being perpetrated. All that was needed was a restricted group of managers and technicians in the know, without everyone else necessarily being informed of what was going on. Also, in the case of the Apollo missions, all that was needed was a small group of NASA's top managers who decided to fake the moon landings, while everyone else at the agency would have believed that the missions were real. For the hoax to succeed, for example, it would have been sufficient to take control of the television signal that was received by the stations on Earth. Officially, the images from the first moonwalk were transmitted directly from the moon and were broadcasted in real time by the television stations all over the world. But if the same moonwalk had been pre-recorded in a studio instead and was then rebroadcast to the receiving stations by a satellite or any other means, then the first people to be duped would have been the very technicians at NASA who were following the moon landings from Houston Space Center. And with them, the entire world would have been deceived.
1986, the shuttle Challenger exploded about 74 seconds after takeoff, killing all 7 astronauts inside. Or did it? It turns out that 6 of the 7 are still alive and kicking today. Ellison Onizuka, claims to be his identical twin brother, Claude. Yeah, I've got an identical twin brother, Claude, too. The Challenger pilot, Mickey Smith, hasn't even bothered changing his name. He's now Professor Michael J. Smith of University of Wisconsin. Now, Krista McAuliffe was a bit of a sneaky one. She was the Challenger payload specialist, quite famous for being a teacher. It turns out during her astronaut days she was using her middle name, Krista, and now she goes by her first name, Sharon, and she's a Syracuse law professor. The Challenger commander, Francis Richard Scobie, is now Dick Scobie, which sounds like a rather unpleasant disease, the CEO of Cows in Trees Limited. Judith Resnick, the Challenger mission specialist, again hasn't even bothered changing her name. She's a professor at Yale Law. And finally, Ronald McNair, another Challenger mission specialist, claims to be his identical twin brother, Carl McNair. What are the odds?
You'd do it all again?
Yeah, I'm sure there'd be trying moments if I did it again. But having gone through it once, I'd be a much smarter person.
And yet, Buzz, it almost destroyed you.
Right. But I think I'm a better man for having experienced it.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away?
Not only does the LEM engine not release any flame from the nozzle, it also seems to produce no particular noise. This is the noise produced by the LEM's ascent engine during a ground test. Yet, during the ascent from the moon, no particular noise can be heard inside the cabin.
Very smooth. Let's couple off.
Only the calm voice of the astronauts, with no engine noise in the background.
Very quiet ride. There's that one crater on there.
Some debunkers claim that the engine sound gets dispersed into the vacuum of space outside the cabin, and therefore no particular noise should be heard from the inside. But the cabin is pressurized, and the engine is located right in the middle of it, between the two astronauts. This NASA technician shows us exactly where the engine is located inside the LEM.
This is the upper docking hatch through which the astronauts will enter the LEM from the command and service module. They will step down here on the ascent engine cover. The engine we looked at before is right on the other side of this cover.
And the very website Clavius states that the ascent engine is mounted inside the spacecraft, not attached to the bottom of it. Activisimo also confirms that the astronauts inside the LEM are literally sitting on the engine.
Praticamente basta avere un cilindro di latta con un motore sotto, e gli astronauti americani erano seduti letteralmente sul motore, cioè già erano qua.
Thus, the engine, which is in direct contact with the pressurized environment of the cabin, should definitely be heard. Another explanation by the debunkers for the lack of engine noise is that the microphones used in aerospace for pilots and crew are built to operate in a noisy environment. You have to speak very close to the microphone in order for the sound to be picked up. But there is no such thing as magic microphones capable of fully excluding the background noise. If the engine noise can reach the ears of the astronaut, it will necessarily be picked up by the microphone as well. Furthermore, during the liftoff of Apollo 15, a curious thing happened. Moments after takeoff, one of the astronauts turned on a portable recorder placed inside the cabin in order to have some musical background.
Good liftoff, automatic.
As one can hear, the music coming from the recorder is clearly picked up by the microphone, while the noise from the engine, which is pushing at full throttle at this time, cannot be heard at all.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. It's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.